Welcome back to the Common Man podcast. Today's guest is James Walters. How are you doing, James?
Doing great. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. I'd like to get things started. Could you share with me, what was it like for you growing up?
Oh man, growing up. My biggest memory from growing up was I was from that generation where we put, hundreds of thousands of miles on our bike just every day. It seemed like from the time I was maybe 5 or 6 and just going around the neighborhood all the time. It didn't matter what time of year it was, what season. It was always riding the bike with a group of kids.
I love that. I was listening to a podcast you were on, and you talked about how you grew up with 5 siblings.
Yeah. Oldest of 5. I wouldn't recommend it, but
actually, it's relatable because I grew up with 5 siblings. I had 5 brothers. I was the second oldest. We put some miles. Me and my older brother, we put some miles on our bike. We were still in that. We just made the cusp where it wasn't just all video games and technology.
Right. I mean, it was something happened where, I don't know, man, parents just got really nervous about just not having their eyes on their kids for a while. I don't remember anything like that, but I was like that with my kids too. I kept them pretty close to home, so they didn't get quite the same childhood that I did.
And I also saw that or heard, that you referred to yourself as a peacemaker. And it's also relatable, even as a second oldest. Like I consider myself more independent, but I always, try to keep the peace, even with, fights with my wife or like with family. It's just like, I don't like confrontation. What was that like for you in your family?
Man, I was definitely that one who was sort of conspiring to keep everybody who needed to be a little more under the radar, keep them under the radar, including myself. And maybe that's why I was out on my bike all the time. I don't know now that I think about it. But yeah, just sort of seeing potential conflicts as they would maybe start bubbling up, and then just being cognizant of that, and then figuring out, okay, how can we avoid this conflict or confrontation? And with a bunch of other younger siblings, that was tough.
Do you think it made you a better like problem solver or conflict resolution type person?
I think, man, that's a double-edged sword, because I know just from all the personal growth and work I've done later on, that's heavily baked into my personality. But there's also an element of manipulation to trying to be someone who's always trying to head off the conflict, and avoiding conflict is just not healthy. And so that's something that I've had to unlearn, to not to avoid all conflicts. Like if I can see something coming and it's easy and it's more valuable to like let it slide or let it go, that part's cool. But I've had to unlearn a whole lot of hey, let's go to a whole lot of trouble to avoid this conflict, because sometimes you have to have healthy conflict. Mm-hmm. And learning that in your grown-up years, that's pretty tough, honestly.
So those are the things you had to unlearn. What are the skills that you had to learn, was in your career or as you're growing up?
Oh, in the career part, I got into a creative field, and I got into photography, which is one of those things where you really early on have to distinguish the fact that like feedback is not criticism. When I was in school, we would always call it critique. So you'd put your work up there, and then the instructor would go through and tell you all the things you did well and tell you all the things could use improvement. But then the class got to throw in their 2 cents as well. And so I had to, and this logically it made sense. So it didn't feel emotionally battered when my work got up there and people just didn't get it, because I could separate the work from myself as a person. And as a business owner, especially now, I've really gotten good at being able to separate who I am as a person from the business, because not everybody is going to like everything you do.
Right.
And uh, yeah, and if you expect that from life, that's gonna be rough. so so yeah, that's one of the things I learned really early on that's been valuable.
So what drew you towards this industry?
Photography
Yeah.
specifically.
For
Oh man.
specifically, yeah.
Yeah, there was something about it that allowed me to create this world that didn't exist. And it was a world that maybe someone else could be looking at the exact same thing that I was looking at. But through my camera, through my lens, the way I was showcasing it, or maybe the way I either cast a shadow or blocked a light or something like that, it always fascinated me that I could be looking at the same thing someone else could, but I could show them a picture. And they're like, man, that is not what I was seeing. And that got me hooked. And that also got me into doing more commercial advertising photography, because I could create a world that didn't exist yesterday and it might not exist tomorrow. And it was just so fun to be able to go through that creative process, because when people hear photography, they hear creative process, they think, oh, all these cool ideas we can do. But really in advertising photography, it's more, okay, how do we get this piece of food to hang this certain way? It's much more practical problem solving, but it ends up you have to do some pretty creative things. You have to connect some dots that weren't there
Mhm.
before, or maybe that you haven't personally connected to be able to pull off what your client needs you to.
And do you feel yourself like experiencing like a flow state or something where you're just like editing, or you're maybe on the site and it just like time goes by?
Man, I had this experience really recently. I came off of this huge project. It was a week-long project, and I had 15,000 photos. I do this project once a year. It's in June, and it typically takes me about three and a half weeks to get through all of those
Jeez.
15,000, get them edited and get them ready to present to the clients. There are several different clients in here, so I'm also organizing them. And I did the craziest thing. I had never been on a cruise before. And my kids, they were out of school. One's in college, one's in high school. They only had literally 5 days of the whole summer where all of our uh, free time overlapped. So I was like, man, we need to do something, but it needs to wrap up like in 5 days. So I found this cruise and we went on this cruise ship. None of us had done it before, but what I realized is you don't have to think about anything when you're on one of those except like, when am I going to eat?
Yeah, yeah.
When do I want to wake up? And this all ties back into the flow state, because I got a great vacation. I was in some nice clear tropical water for half a day and all that stuff. But in the downtimes, there were a lot of times my kids wanted to just go back to the room and chill or take a nap or whatever. And so I would get my laptop. I would go into the lounge. I had a huge window. I was looking at the ocean. And I was like, this is pretty cool.
Yeah.
There was music going on. And I would just get into that flow state, and like 2-3 hours would go by. I wouldn't even notice it, but not even exaggerating. And I don't know how it happened, because it happened in little short bursts throughout the thing. But I got a great vacation, and I actually think I relaxed, but I came back with all 15,000 of those photos being totally edited
Oh my
and
God.
ready to go, when there was a little airport time in there too that I was crunching photos. But I think just having that, and I've talked to some people, I'm like, how did that happen? I don't know how it happened. It didn't, certainly wasn't the intention. I was going to just knock a little work out on the plane and that kind of stuff. But
Mhm.
I think that focused time, just being in flow and not having things I really had to think about, because
Right.
I've been editing photos for, 25 years now. So it's pretty second nature, and I can do it quickly, but not that quickly if I'm at home, for sure.
Yeah. It reminds me of like watching someone on YouTube like doing like a Premiere Pro like video editing, and there's like a million little tiny things on the screen, and they're just editing like second nature. It's like a
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
insane to see that.
That's a whole different level for sure.
I could just imagine you just going and flow like on the computer, just on your natural. Because I'm sure you built a workflow for your editing and where you start and where you, and how you're going. So,
Yeah.
how do you merge the creative side with your business side? Like, did you have to um, learn how to run a business, learn how to, did you make mistakes, and how was that like?
Oh man, so many mistakes, and that's the best. It's tough. I was on a podcast a couple days ago, and it was a business focus podcast, and they wanted a little bit of background on the business. And man, for me, it was both good and bad because I came into photography in a time where it was transitioning from film to digital. And one of the things was, I was fresh out of school, so I had learned all the stuff about digital. So the people who were actually had a ton more experience than me, they had a lot less experience in the way things were headed. So they were kind of behind the game. But the thing I pointed out was like success is not a really good teacher. Like when you get into something and it's going really well right off the bat,
Right.
that feels cool, but at the same time, you don't learn some of the bumps and scrapes along the way that you might if things didn't go as well. So I had a pretty great first 10, 15 years. And then some life stuff caught up with me in terms of just relationship stuff, family, family grandparents reach a certain age and they're going to start dying off, right? That kind of thing. So that phase of life started catching up with me. And that's when business got hard because that was also the same time the economy was tanking back in like '08 and all of that. So a lot of things came together to make me start to figure out, okay, how am I going to enjoy my business and my life? And that's when I had to make a lot of really hard decisions, and all of the personal work and growth and things that period of my life like began is what made me decide, hey, I need to enjoy what I'm doing. I've always been that person who integrated my work with my life because I like to work. And so it better be fun. And so pulling that creative part in and making it my identity, but not making the job my identity is where I landed. And so now, luckily, I've got a job that can fit both of those things. It can fit the work part because we've got to make money, but also fit the creativity part. And that's where my podcast that I've been working on the last 2 years has come in as well. I'm a storyteller now. That's what I tell people. I tell stories through photographs and I tell stories through podcasts. And there's a lot of room for creativity in there in both of those things.
Yeah, I was listening to you speak on another podcast, and you mentioned something like almost like a crisis type feeling you had, which made you want to pivot, right?
Yeah, man. My podcast, the theme of it is all about that time. And a lot of it is for people who are kind of getting into that midlife age range around the 35 to 50 is when something usually happens, and it doesn't have to be catastrophic. Sometimes it's just like you wake up one day and you're like, man, I don't want to go to this job anymore. Or you realize that there's just something not right. For me, it was a little more of a slow burn with a lot of big traumatic things. But they were all going on around me. And it was family members dying like one after the other. It was this economy thing that was going on back then. It was my relationship in my marriage wasn't going as great as I thought it was. And so the culmination of all of that made me start asking a lot of questions like, okay, if none of this is my identity anymore, well, who am I? Like, what am I here for? What am I about now? And that just started a long series of reading a lot of books, talking to a lot of people to get perspective and trying to figure out, okay, what do I do now? And so that's a lifelong question to answer. Like, what do I
Yeah.
do now?
Right.
So but finding joy in answering that question instead of finding some sort of, oh God, like instead of weighing heavy on you, if you can find joy, okay, I've got the ability to do something now. What's it going to be?
Right. So
That's been the fun part.
do you help people on your podcast find something towards that? Or what is that?
I,
What is it like on your podcast? Like,
yeah, the thing about the podcast, I started that as a way to have really awesome conversations with people who have either been through what I call their own joyful rebellion. And joyful rebellion, the reason for the name is just when you hit that point in your life, you realize something needs to change. You want more life out of life, and you have to do something. And most often you want to do something to make you happier, and you have to do a little rebellion. You have to either rebel against what you've been taught, in your family programming, whatever that is, what society's taught you was going to make you happy, and it didn't. And for me, I just wanted to tell people stories. So I talk to people who have been through their own joyful rebellion. I talk to people who help other people get to their joyful rebellion, like people like coaches and things like that. I don't do any coaching myself. So all the help that someone would get would be really just from getting a different perspective from the podcast. And if they tune in and they're like, oh man, that was a really cool takeaway, I need to know more. And maybe they call that person that I was talking to, or just check out their website or read their book or whatever it might be. That's the way that I want to be helping people.
wow. And there's a question I wanted to ask you. I have a lot of younger listeners, and when chaos seems like it's all around them, like something you've experienced, what are some practical steps that people can take to kind of settle themselves or refocus?
Yeah, man, that's such a good question. And I love that question because it really comes down to understanding that no matter, and I don't know, have you read the book, Mark Manson's book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck?
I think I've read.
You can
I
blink
picked
it.
it up. I picked it up. Yeah, you can.
All
You can.
right.
It's fine.
All right. So I read that book years and years ago. It's a great book, but the book, the main tenet of the book is you're always going to have problems, and billionaires have billionaire level problems, and people who don't have a home, they have the kind of problems that you have if you don't have a home or enough to eat. So no matter where you are, no matter how good things look on the outside, everyone has problems. And as you get more successful, you upgrade one problem for the next set of problems. So if you can get out of the mentality of, okay, I'm going to get here and then I'll be loving life. If you can go ahead and set up your expectation to, okay, I'm going to get here and then I'm going to trade my, if you're just getting out of college or something like that, I'm going to trade, whatever that set of finances look like, that set of living conditions. I'm going to trade that for something a little different, but maybe that little different costs more. And now you feel a little more squeezed because you're living better, but you feel a little more pressure because, you're footing the bill for all of that.
Right.
So there's that piece. But then whenever you do really have a struggle or crisis or something comes out of left field, you're like, man, this isn't how I wanted it to be. Just realize and think about, like, how much of a problem is this? Is this a 5-minute problem? Because some things are just 5-minute problems and they're really annoying. And some things are 5-hour problems. Some things, like if your car, like really something weird happens and you don't have enough in the bank to cover it, that could be like a 5-month problem to get the car fixed so you can go to your job and then repay that credit card or however you paid to keep things moving. But if you can kind of quantify it like this, it doesn't make everything like hopeless, because you can see some light at the end of the tunnel.
Wow, that's good. Uh, let's going back to your stories. You said you love to tell stories. What's one of the favorite stories you like to tell in your photographs or in your podcast?
I When it comes to stories with photography, I love to show people a version of themselves they've never seen. And it's not exactly that's not a story necessarily, but when people see a photograph of themselves, typically, like if a friend took it, it's a cheesy smile, like the third grade smile that your parents made you do for your entire existence while you live with them. But I love to be able to photograph a person, show them a side of themselves they've never really seen before. And sometimes they're uncomfortable with it until they realize, oh, that's really me. That's like the me that people see. That's not the Instagram me. And when it comes to telling stories on the podcast, I just always love the stories. And I'm no different than anybody else when it comes to this, but I love the stories where people had to come to some sort of decision, and they were
Yeah.
going one way in their life, and maybe they got uh, something thrown at them that they didn't ask for, and they just had to figure it out.
Yeah. That's so good.
But when they do, yeah, and when they do, sometimes it takes them a while to commit to it. And that's the biggest thing I always like to really bring out in everyone's interview that I do is like, we all see these things going on social media and we hear the wild turnaround stories. But I really like to go back to every single time, like, how long did that really take? Because now you went from this and then you were in the deep dark uh you know bad times, and then you figured out you were going to turn it around, and you did turn it around. Look at you're really successful now. But how long did that take? And usually it's years. uh Very few people like turn it around in a couple of months, and if they did, it wouldn't be that interesting of a story, would it?
Wow. Yeah. And I think a lot of us try to come up with a hack, right? Life hack, or I'm going to turn
Yeah,
turn this around in a few months, and then you get to the few months and you disappoint yourself.
it's
It's not. It just doesn't happen
man,
that
it's
quickly.
a time proven thing to do. If you really want to disappoint yourself, try to get there quick or cut a corner, and then you realize, okay, I just need to go back and do it right. When I was going through that period, it was about a decade or so ago, and I was just not happy. Everything in my life was just not going the way it was supposed to. And so I started doing the weirdest thing. Looking back, it makes sense logically, but knowing what I know now, I guess I had to go through that experience anyway. But I started reading all these books on happiness. I started doing all these meditations on happiness. And I was obsessed with trying to figure out, okay, how do I be happy? And I think it was like the eighth or ninth book, I'm not even exaggerating, on happiness. And they were all kind of saying the same things, that I realized, crap, I just need to stop reading books about how to be happy. I need to go create a life
Yeah.
that is going to make me that way. And it's going to suck for a while because I'm going to flail around not knowing what the heck I'm doing because I'm an amateur at this.
Right.
And, going through doing the hard work, doing the real work. And it did take a couple of years before I uh, developed the skills to be able to just realize that, hey man, it's all up to me. Not everything's up to me, but because it's not. So few things are truly up to us except for our mindset, what we choose to think about, how we choose to react to things. But man, those few little things we do have control over really can affect almost everything else.
Yeah. And I love what you said. And like you had to like stop reading the books. I mean, I've been there myself. I'm reading all the books, and sometimes I feel like I started this podcast just to talk to other people that have been through it the same way, same things. And sometimes I sit there and I'm just like, what's my purpose? What do I do next, and things like that. So I think we all face those existential questions that kind of take a lifetime to figure out how to get somewhere. But when do you think people do find a purpose in life? Does it, is it just timing?
I think the lucky ones stumble on it. And I think just from the conversations I've had when I am doing the podcast and just conversations I've had along the way in my life with people, they tend to stumble on it when they're helping someone else. And there's really an energy that comes around helping someone else in a certain way. So maybe they were doing a certain kind of job and that job paid their bills. But then when they either go out bowling or they talk to someone outside of their actual work. And I think that's one thing that a lot of people, they think their work has to be their purpose.
Right.
And a lot of times they miss it because they're so like, I've got to love my job. I got to love what I do. I've got to make my purpose my vocation or what gets me paid. And that's not always going to be the thing. Like right now with me, I feel like my purpose is to help tell other people's stories and get it to a wider audience. I make $0 doing that on the podcast, like zero. So it's not paying the bills. I'm still over here taking photos, loving that just as much, but I'm feeling my energy is being multiplied and growing with the podcast. Is at least that's how I feel. And so I'm really having to keep those two things, my job and what I feel like my purpose is, pretty separate, and be happy with those coexisting in the same life, but not trying to mash them all up into being the same thing.
Wow, that was really powerful. I love what you said, that they stumble on it or find it. Oh, my camera's going crazy. But they stumble on it or find it, when they're helping somebody, and that almost makes me want to pivot some things, or just make sure that I'm helping more people, or I guess instead of like the intentions, right? The intentions of, are you helping others around you? Are you continuously because when we think about our purpose, it's more like I. When am I going to get there? When am I going to feel something? When am I going to get? But that makes so much sense, when you're helping others.
Yeah, and whenever I hear people, and I mean, I've struggled with this too. And some days I still like, okay, am I doing the right thing? And when you don't see something growing, or if you see hit a plateau, or these things that are supposed to make you struggle, and the people that I talk with who are the most frustrated with trying to figure out their purpose are the people who kind of have that expectation that their purpose is going to be some sort of like Oprah purpose. It's going to be like they are going to set the world on fire. And sometimes your purpose, like the whole reason you were born and went through all this crap you've gone through, is so you can maybe have a conversation with a person who can relate to it, and you change the trajectory of their entire life. And you might never even know it. Wow. You might not be able to see it, but that was your purpose. And if you're walking around trying to say, okay, I don't know my purpose yet, I don't know my purpose, because you're not seeing any kind of, grand thing going on in your life, you might be missing the very thing that's happening in front of you that is your purpose.
Dang, man, mind blowing me right now. So I love, I love to hear that, and I love having these types of conversations. But just kind of going back to your vocation, and what advice would you have for someone that wants to start their own photography business, or maybe the different situation where they have a photography business, and maybe they're not happy about it, or maybe it's not being as successful. Like, how would you promote yourself in that way, in like today's terms?
Yeah, definitely. As digital as the world is right now, it's still all about the relationships and all about the people. And it also depends on what kind of photography you're going to do. That's the thing I love about the photography industry, the business, I tend to get bored pretty easily. So I've gone from advertising photography into portrait photography. I did a lot of weddings for years because I was of the mind that I needed more of a challenge. And the thing I loved about weddings were I was telling the same story pretty much every time with a different cast. And
Mhm.
I related it to being like a play where you've got the cast, you've got the script, you've got the wardrobe, you've got the audience. And by the way, all of the cast is amateurs and they've only practiced it one time before like opening night. Right. So there's a lot of cool stuff that can happen in there, but the like portrait business is very different from an advertising business. So just understand what kind of business you're getting into, who's your real customer at the end, and then try to find those people and make connections with them and not just think, oh, I'm posting all the time on Instagram, or networking is still very important, especially in businesses that are owned by a single person, or, like you and me. I don't know if you've thought about going to like a podcast movement or something like that, but I've gone to two now, just being a podcaster who doesn't even make money with their podcast yet, but I've met so many people in person, shook their hands, and now I can call up those people if I've got a question, whether it's technical, whether it's like monetization, whatever it might be. But we didn't meet online. So if there was any advice I'd give to anyone, whether it's photography business or any kind of business, just go out in the world and meet real humans that are interested in what you either have to offer with your business or interested in the same things that you are.
Yeah, wow, that's awesome. I've seen things like that. Never took the leap into it, but hearing you talk about it, it does sound helpful, right? Being in the same community where people are supporting each other.
Yeah, and it's an investment. It's kind of like that thing again. When you become a business owner, you're sort of upgrading your set of problems. So now you got a whole different, um, a new kind of set of priorities and things you have to do, but it's worth it. Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
definitely. All right, James, as we wrap up here, a couple last questions. You mentioned books. You say stop reading the happiness books, okay? but
Stop.
what any type of book that you have for me that I as a maybe a practical book or something that would be helpful that you thought was impactful in your life?
Yeah, man. I really did enjoy the that book by Mark Manson, The Subtle Art. And he's got a couple of other books that are a really quick read and they just kind of give you a little bit of perspective. But also, I picked up a couple books from Ryan Holiday about Stoicism a few years ago, and man, I just like that philosophy. And a lot of people confuse Stoicism; they think it's the elimination of emotions,
Hmm.
but it's actually the domestication. It's like, okay, we're going to have emotions. We don't have control over those, but we can control what we do next, is
Mm.
kind of the whole philosophy. We can't just shut them off. That's not a human thing. And so reading some of those things that these men wrote thousands of years ago that apply to our situation now, I was like, man, that's pretty cool. And Ryan Holiday does a good job of breaking it down into understandable chunks that we can understand. I don't really understand ancient Roman speak or all the Greek stuff they would say, but if you can, like a lot of books, if you can break it down into modern English,
Yeah,
I can.
I tried to read the Marcus Aurelius and I couldn't get through the first couple pages.
Yeah,
I was
man.
like,
Like
what is going on here?
I know I tried to read The Art of War, many years ago, and without it being, I mean, not the Japanese version, obviously, but it was translated, but it wasn't translated to modern English. And I was like, man, I put that down. And now that I've got a more updated for today's speak, how we talk about things. I'm like, man, that's a really cool book.
All right. Also, you're an author as well. Do you have a book out or something that you're promoting?
I've got, so it'll be out pretty soon. It'll be out kind of more toward the holidays, but I'm just wrapping up the editing and all the proofing on my second book. The first book was like a memoir of my life when I was a wedding photographer, all the crazy stuff people want to hear from the behind the scenes. So that's been out for a while, like 10 years. It's called Accessory to Marriage. So it's on Amazon. But the one I'm working on now is a picture book. So it's a larger format picture book. It's called Meditations of the Mundane. Okay. And it's kind of like in photography, we tend to objectify people sometimes. We don't mean to, but like when I was in advertising, if you wanted to sell a pair of jeans, you could sell it easier if there was a model in the jeans and people could see how it fit. Right. Mm-hmm. But we didn't care about the model. We don't care what their name is or how they feel about wearing the jeans. We just want to see the jeans. And so this book kind of flips that script, and it's 100% pictures of things that I've seen out on walks in cities that I love to walk around in. And they're things that people would pass right by, but they're objects. And instead of just letting them be objects, I gave them a personality. And so each photo has its own story that comes from the perspective of whatever that object is. If it's a hair tie that I saw on the sidewalk, and I started thinking, okay, well, how long has it been there? Who did it belong to? Like, mm-hmm. How long were they together? How did they end up, being apart? All of that stuff. So that was a really fun exercise, and yeah, it'll be out around November.
All right, nice.
Yeah.
Hearing you talking about it, it reminded me of a book called Think Like a Monk by Jay Shetty. Okay. So, yeah, he spent time meditating with actual monks, in a different country, and one of the exercises they had to do every morning, it was go on their morning walks, and they had to pick something out of the ordinary every single day. So whether it was a rock, where there was a leaf cracking the sidewalk, something they had to pick and meditate on it every morning. And I was like, oh, it's so interesting, because I guess it's like bringing you back to being present and being aware, because sometimes you'll go on a walk and your mind is just going off in your brain like 1,000 miles an hour.
Yeah, for sure. And that project did make me focus on what I was seeing as I was going for walks. And the things I would see are not the things you would see if you were on a bike or in a car. And so being on a walk, you're slow enough to be able to really experience the world. Mm-hmm. So that was fun.
Yeah. And it must have been meditative for you to do that.
It was. And I forced myself, all of the photos I took with my phone. So it's not like I took a camera out into the world and was like, I'm going to take some pictures. A lot of times they were things like, oh, that's really cool. Or it had just rained and, oh man, the way this looks, it didn't look that cool yesterday, but it's still just a board on, a boardwalk or something. But yeah, just appreciating things that most people would walk right by.
Yeah. That's awesome, man. So where can people follow you, James?
Yeah, the best way is pretty straightforward. My name, I got a website, jameswalters.com, and that showcases pretty much all the stuff that I'm working on right now. It's got the links to the books, got links to podcasts, and a little bit more about me and what I do.
Awesome. And one final question here to sign off. There's a billboard on the street. If it could say one thing, what would you have it say?
Oh, there's a billboard on the street. Ha. Man, put down the books about happiness and go create that happy life for yourself, because you can. Yeah. And yeah, it's within every one of us. So I'd say put down the book and go live life.
I love that. All right. Thank you so much, James, for being part of the podcast. I can't wait to go back and listen to this and hear your advice again.
Oh man, it was so good being here, and thanks for having me, man. I really appreciate it. It's good to talk with someone who, loves having a great conversation. I
Yeah,
think that's what we did here.
of course. It was a pleasure.
Thanks.